Evening, blog viewers. Try to complete this post by the time it gets dark here, so we'll get right to it. We'll continue talking about the written and the unwritten. We are these terms that we're going to use. We've been using on the blog a lot. I spent quite a bit of time on the June 23rd, 2013 post on Montaigne in the video discussing what those terms mean and the implications. And so, if there's any if you're just coming in on a blog and you see, a lot of discussion of the written and unwritten, go back to that June 23rd post for all the background you need. So, getting right into it, one question I want to start out with is, what is unwritten reality producing and what is it not producing? That's a very important question. We've talked a lot about what the written produces and what it doesn't produce, and what it produces with error and what it produces correctly, but let's talk a little bit more about what unwritten reality is producing and what it's not producing. We'll start with what it's not producing. I think you can say that the unwritten is not producing human error or any sort of error of any sort on the part of any living creature. It's not, none of the unwritten is actually causing anyone to err on its own. Second, I would say the unwritten is not producing, very importantly, human fear or human hopes of any sort. Fear or hope is never, although we may think it is, it's never really out there within reality. It's never really out there in the air, in your environment, in a room you're in your office. It's human fear or hope is always in your mind, and it's pretty much nowhere else within reality. And I would say, thirdly, the unwritten is not producing intents of any sort on the part of the written. The unwritten is not pushing anyone to do any specific thing. The unwritten is not working toward any specific end. It's simply continuing to perpetuate itself, has been doing this for several billions of years, not just here on Earth, but everywhere, just continuing to operate as a perfectly errorless, automatic, self-enforcing system that simply executes its laws without error and without delay, perfectly all over the place. I would say now, with respect to what the unwritten is producing, there would be three important things that it's producing. First, it's producing life. The unwritten is the independent variable, while the one way to think about it would be the unwritten is sort of an independent variable, while the written is totally dependent upon the written. The unwritten, sorry. The unwritten pre-existed the written by several billions of years and gave birth to the written, the first cell. Not entirely clear how it happened, but it's pretty clear that the unwritten pre-existed and therefore at some point gave birth to the written. Life for the written, any of the written, whether a human being, a bird, a plant, minimally requires the sun's energy and gravitational pull. It requires water, it requires air, it requires food of some sort, and shelter of some sort. Less so, shelter probably less so with some of the animals, and bacteria and stuff. But for many plants and certainly for humans, those things are required. And all of these things are either unwritten. Certainly, the sun's energy and gravitational pull is unwritten. Water, air is unwritten. And in the case of food and shelter, you require the use of the unwritten to produce those things. You can't cook food without fire. You can't, which is unwritten. You can't make a home without unwritten chemicals and materials of all sorts. So life, I would say, is certainly produced by the unwritten. Second, I would say the unwritten produces the preconditions for any activity of any meaningful sort of the written creatures. Because the unwritten is 100% errorless, you can depend on it, and humans have depended on it completely for many, many years. And other written creatures have depended on it as they partake in their daily activities. So, for example, the errorlessness of the unwritten allows us to build skyscrapers, it allows us to build office buildings, stadiums, airplanes, boats, bicycles, ski lifts, and a million other things that allow humans to do the millions of things we do on a daily basis. If the unwritten was error-prone, if it was making error, none of this would be possible. Boats would sink for no reason, skyscrapers would fall for no reason, people would be terrified to do literally anything because they couldn't rely on these things to basically stay together. Thankfully, though, the unwritten is completely errorless and completely untamperable. So no one can go in and change the laws of gravity that apply to a building. No one can go, or an airplane or whatever. And so, and because it's errorless, we're all basically depending on it. As I'm sitting on this chair again, I'm depending on all the atoms within it to be operating correctly, gravity to hold it together, and many other laws that I'm probably not even aware of at this point, unwritten laws. And again, the 100% errorlessness of it allows us to depend on these things and go about doing the activities we need to do. And that is, again, something that the unwritten produces. And here, I think, as an aside, I think this line of thought, this argument, shows why unwritten reality is not just perfect and errorless, but also good. You might say, okay, well, unwritten reality, even though it, let's say, is errorless, and although, let's say, we're not aware of any error, it's not good. It's just, it's too far. It's stretching it too much to say it's good. It just is. It just is what it is. You can't really say it's good. But I think here you see anything that's 100% errorless and dependable every time for human purposes. I think you have to consider it good. Because it allows us to engage in basically all the activities that make life even moderately interesting. When you add to it that it makes life of any sort, forget about the activities that make life interesting, but makes life of any sort possible, then unless you regard life itself as very bad, which I think is an extreme position, then you have to say the unwritten is actually not only perfect and errorless, but also good. The third thing the unwritten produces, I would say, is, we've talked about this a little bit, is it produces information as pure substance, emanating to any creatures that can use it. The unwritten is producing infinities of information as pure substance every second for every creature here on Earth, and it's producing information on other planets and other galaxies. The same thing. There's just usually on those other planets, there's no one to take in the information because Earth is the only planet that is known to have life. And so this emanating by this generation of infinite information as pure substance by the unwritten is for the benefit of all species. It's not just, the information is not just produced for man or for certain plants or for certain bacteria. It's produced for every species, from the simplest bacteria to worms to palm trees to dogs to humans. But the key point is the unwritten is only producing or generating this information. It's only producing it. It's doing it without bias or without any deceptive intent. It's just producing it without error. But it's not gathering. It's not gathering the information either here on Earth nor anywhere else. And it's not interpreting it or making sense of it. It's just spitting it out. So therefore, information, unwritten information as pure substance, can only be gathered, interpreted, and made sense of by a written observer. There has to be a written living observer that can actually gather in and observe this information and make sense of it. And or, in the case of, for example, the Hubble Space Telescope, a tool created by a living creature, which then, as the Hubble is taking the pictures, then sends it back to Earth, and astronauts or people at NASA observe, look at the images and make sense of it. But in general, information that's generated from unwritten reality requires a written observer to take it in, and no observer is errorless. Observers are generally, I would say, error-prone in taking in unwritten information. There's generally also a huge range in observational ability among the written. But the key point here is that because no observer is errorless and is typically error-prone, error is introduced into the process of this unwritten information that's coming in as pure substance without error. It's introduced at the level of only when we reach the observer. That's the first point with respect to the observer of the unwritten information, where we get error of any sort coming in. It's not within the unwritten processes. It's not within the unwritten system. It's only when you get to the level of the observer that you get an error in the processing of the information. That's the first loci, you could call it, of error. The observer can introduce, basically in this way, can introduce error into a process which had till that point been totally perfect and errorless. Now, some creatures, I would say, are limited by virtue of not having either many sensory gathering tools and or brain power to make sense of whatever sensory information is coming in. Our species, man, in general, has both very good sensory inputs and almost unlimited brain power to make sense of information as it's coming in. The human mind is totally limitless, or almost limitless. The rest of the body, of course, and all the sensory apparatus has limits, though in most cases the limits are pretty wide. The human eye, for example, has some 100 million rods and 3 million cones to take in color and black and white images and process that information. The mind, though, has very few limits. The mind can continue getting better. The mind can continue getting better at processing information and understanding it and absorbing it more fully. And I think that's basically the task of lifelong learning and education and observation and basically perfection. Among humans, though, again, there is a range of observational ability. Some are just awful at this, some are fantastic. What distinguishes the two would be the key question. What distinguishes someone that's just awful at taking in information as it's coming in, and someone that's very good at it? And I want to suggest three things would distinguish the one from the other. One is the person that's good. The factors are attention to unwritten information as it is streaming in as pure substance. Not a delayed attention, but sort of real-time attention to unwritten information as it's streaming in. Another factor is the tools at your disposal. Obviously, you can see much more with a microscope or a binocular than you would otherwise be able to see. And the third factor would be a lack of bias. Each one of these lack of sort of a prejudice or bias that's causing you to see or hear something differently, typically in the way you want to hear it rather than the way that it actually is. Now, improving each one of these things, I think, expands your access to unwritten information that's coming in as pure substance and allows you to understand it better. Once you take it in better, you're typically likely to understand it better, use it better, incorporate it better, and likewise, wow, what a beautiful sunset here. I'm going to just move this for a second up here so you can see it. Beautiful clouds tonight. Not sure you can see it, but anyway. Sorry about that. Let's put this back here. Okay. So again, improving those things, those three factors, would improve your ability. And from a practical perspective, again, those three factors: attention to unwritten information as it is streaming in as pure substance, lack of bias, and better tools. But from a practical perspective, unless you're doing some sort of science work or whatever in a laboratory, you can't really bring tools in. You can't record conversations generally with people. You can't take binoculars everywhere you go. That would be kind of silly. So you're left with two factors: attending to unwritten information as it is streaming in on a real-time basis, and eradicating any biases or prejudices you have with respect to information as it is coming in. Once you do these things and you get better and better at it, I think you're likely to trust what you're observing at any point in time really is everything that you need to observe to make some sort of decision. You won't be riddled with so much doubt that you're, quote, missing something big, because you're in fact attending to information, you're taking it in without bias, you're taking in more than you otherwise do, and so you're much less likely, I think, to be riddled with doubt that you're missing a whole lot of information that's relevant. But how do you do this? How do you improve your ability to absorb and take in information attentively and without error, without biases? I think everyone is capable of improving in this respect. I don't think it's beyond anyone's ability. And I think in some activities we can get a glimpse of ways of activities in which we are already doing this. We are taking in information pretty well, and I think we should probably focus on what we're doing right in those activities and see if we can bring that to other areas of our lives. Now, look at the example I would suggest of various recreational activities people enjoy. Why do so many people love cycling and skiing and running and snowboarding, meditation, boating, many other activities? I mean, I think our culture has become literally obsessed with recreational activities, and everyone seems to enjoy it and try to add more and more of these activities to their list of pursuits. And why is it people enjoy this that much? What's going on in the activity that is in fact so enjoyable? And I think in each of these activities you can see that everyone that's engaged in it in a relatively decent manner and is doing it correctly is paying very close attention to unwritten information as it is streaming in. In a sense, you have to do this or you'll have an accident. In cycling or skiing, you can't not focus on what's coming in through the senses. You have to focus very intently on what's coming in, or else you will literally have an accident. People engaged in these activities often aren't talking very much. Their mind is, again, just focused on the activity itself. There's usually not much bias that's operating when people are engaged in these activities. Usually the mind is sort of a little bit shut off from its typical biases and thought patterns. And it's certainly not the same bias or thought patterns that predominate when you're at work and your boss is talking to you, or when you're listening to a political speech of that sort. That's just not the sort of attention that or the brain activity that's happening during those activities. And so in each of these activities, whether it be skiing or cycling or running or snowboarding, meditation, boating, fishing, many other activities of this sort, I think you can see what's happening is the mind is dispensing with its customary, ordinary written thoughts or verbal thoughts, many of which are not only error-prone but are pure form, and preventing or blocking the person from focusing entirely on the unwritten information as it is streaming in as pure substance. Your mind is focusing and fixating on pure form in these, and generally I think in day-to-day life, I think all too many of us, the mind is focusing and fixating on verbal pure form rather than pure substance, on mind-made errors and forms rather than pure unwritten information that's coming in as pure substance without error. And so I think the path to perfection here again might involve changing this approach significantly, and each of us would spend much less time attending to mind-made written verbal errors of all sorts, and much more time, real time, focusing on information on a real-time basis as it's streaming in without error through the unwritten processes. And of course this activity, I think, has to fall within our silence and stillness virtue for many of the reasons I've discussed through this post, focusing intently, shutting off the pure form that's typically circulating through the mind, and attending to information silently as it's coming in. And I think because of that, we'll place this in our Silence and Stillness virtue series, and we'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.